did the original inhabitants of the Pacific come from? Did they come from Asia or from South America? Or did they come from both sides of the Pacific? The DNA of the animals they carried aboard their canoes, the origins of their language, and almost all their crops point very clearly to origins in Asia. But there is one striking exception, the kumara, or sweet potato, of South America. This crop is not native to the Pacific Islands, yet had already reached all three corners of the Polynesian Triangle well before Europeans arrived. Most scholars naturally assumed that the tubers had been collected and distributed from the Americas by Polynesians. However, a Norwegian adventurer named Thor Heyerdahl disagreed. During an 18-month stay in the Marquesas Islands in the 1930s, he concluded that the credit for this surely belonged to a superior race. He could not bring himself to believe that Polynesians were capable of carving the stone statues he saw on these islands. Noting that prevailing winds here blow from the east, he suggested that the island's original inhabitants were from South America. In the 16th century, when the first Spanish explorers were sailing up the Pacific coast of South America, they saw rafts made out of local balsa logs, as shown in this drawing from near Guayaquil, Ecuador, published in 1748. Clearly, the indigenous people of the region were indeed sailors, and their rafts may have sailed along the coastline as far as Mexico. But how seaworthy would such craft be for a long voyage out into the open ocean? This question prompted Thor Heyerdahl to embark on one of the greatest ocean expeditions of the 20th century, when he set out into the Pacific from Peru in 1947 with 5 crew aboard a primitive raft of balsa logs. This raft was named Kon-Tiki. After more than 3 months at sea, his raft wrecked almost 7,000 kilometers downwind on one of the Tuamotu Islands. The crew thankfully survived the impact and were able to dry out their radios sufficiently to call for help. Their courageous voyage resulted in a book and a documentary film, both of which proved wildly successful. Heyerdahl was understandably triumphant where he had made his point. A one-way voyage of this kind was indeed possible. To lend support to Heyerdahl's theories, William Willis repeated the experiment by sailing solo aboard another balsa raft from Peru in 1954. He successfully reached Samoa aboard his craft named Seven Little Sisters. Then came a Czech adventurer, Edward Ingres, aboard another balsa raft from Peru, which languished for 3 months in the equatorial countercurrent until the crew were rescued by an American warship. On his second attempt in 1959, he managed to reach another island in the Tuamotus. The rafters kept coming. In 1966, Spanish adventurer Vital Alçar set out from Ecuador aboard La Pacifica. When it sank 143 days later, the crew were rescued by a German ship. In 1970 and 1973, Alçar went on to launch more successful voyages and managed to reach Australia. Next came professional adventurer Phil Buck, leading 3 Viracocha expeditions from Arica, Chile, in 2000, 2003 and 2006. The first reached Easter Island, where they reportedly received a cool reception from the residents, by now wearied of theories about the pre-European arrival of tall, fair-skinned ancestors from the east. Following in his grandfather's footsteps came Olaf Heyerdahl aboard Tangaroa from Peru in 2006, equipped this time with modern navigation, communication and desalination equipment, an $800,000 venture backed by the Norwegian government, private business and his grandfather's hometown of Larvik in Norway. This European fascination for rafting into the Pacific continued into the next decade with the Kon-Tiki II expedition, sailing 2 balsa rafts from Peru to Easter Island in 2015 and halfway back, before requiring rescue by a Japanese freighter. Clearly, it was not so easy to get back. Indeed, the cost of rescue and salvage operations would often exceed that of the voyages themselves, begging the question, why? Why would a Native American with a whole continent at their disposal risk heading downwind out of sight of land for a month or more? And why would they keep careful watch for so long over a cargo of tubers to take to somewhere they did not yet know existed? When it came to Polynesians, these questions were much easier to answer, for they were experienced at transporting planting material, knew of their own need of a drought-tolerant tuber, and possessed the requisite wayfinding skills to relocate the islands where it could be grown. These great rafting adventures did clearly demonstrate two things, though. One, the prevailing winds and currents of the region, and two, a prevailing reluctance to give credit to Polynesians for one of their greatest voyaging achievements. We know from the ancient DNA of the Polynesian strain of the vegetable that this did indeed come from Ecuador, a region where we find the same indigenous name that Polynesians traditionally use for the vegetable, kumara. It's no coincidence that the crop is known in the Pacific by similar names, by Māori in New Zealand as kumara, on Easter Island as komara, and on Hawaii as uala. The route of its transfer from Ecuador can be traced through multiple lines of evidence to the general region of the Marquesas Islands, involving an initial voyage of some 6,500 kilometers, which is likely to have lasted for at least a month. As the rafting experiments have clearly shown, the winds are blowing almost constantly from the east at this latitude. If Polynesians were responsible for the transfer, they must have reached South America from a point much further south, the region of Easter Island, or Rapa Nui. Of course, Polynesians could not have known in advance that by continuing east from Easter Island, they would find a continent with kumara, but they were highly experienced explorers, ever on the lookout for new islands and fishing grounds. Some 3,000 kilometers east of Easter Island, they would enter the Humboldt Current, which would carry them north through increasing numbers of fur seals, enormous shoals of fish, and myriad seabirds, including Humboldt penguins. Steering back into the Pacific would be difficult until they reached Ecuador, where the prevailing current and winds are again in their favor. Here they would find their first large natural harbor, the Gulf of Guayaquil, a good place to reprovision, and the very place where Polynesians are understood to have tasted their first kumara. How long they stayed in South America is not known, but when it came time for them to leave on the prevailing wind, some of the local people may possibly have gone with them. With their precious cargo of seed tubers on board, these experienced navigators headed west to the general region of the Marquesas Islands, from where they distributed kumara tubers to the outlying islands of Easter Island, New Zealand, and Hawaii. How quickly all this occurred, we don't know. It may have taken generations, or perhaps some of the crew carrying kumara tubers on to Easter Island were on board the canoe or canoes that had originally left this region to reach South America. But at some point, a crew did reach Easter Island with this new crop to add to their existing Polynesian crops of banana, sugarcane, paper mulberry, taro, yam, gourd, and Pacific Island cabbage tree that they had brought island by island from Southeast Asia. Sadly, much of the original oral history of this island has been lost, but we can still picture their remarkable maritime skills from the evidence they left behind, and from other non-instrument navigators elsewhere in the Pacific. This is Master Navigator Colosso Kaveia, whose skills stem from an unbroken lineage of Polynesian wayfinding on Taumako in the Duff Islands in the Western Pacific. And this is Master Shipbuilder Tinanoa of Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands, Kiribati, who built a traditional craft and navigated it without instruments for more than 2,000 kilometers to Fiji. That was in 1976. And here is Mau Pualag from Satawal in the Caroline Islands, a Micronesian master navigator who helped revive the art of traditional wayfinding in the Pacific by navigating the Hokulea from the Hawaiian Islands to Tahiti without instruments, also in 1976. Despite all the downwind experiments inspired by Heyerdahl, there is no real reason to believe that balsa rafts were used to bring kumara into the Pacific, especially when Polynesian replica canoes have gone on to visit all three corners of the Polynesian Triangle and have since completed a 3-year voyage right around the planet. Credit where credit is due. It was Polynesians who introduced the kumara to the Pacific.